I'm Neel Gandhi, a partner at McKinsey, lead our talent practice.
I'm Charlotte Seiler. I'm an associate partner also at McKinsey. I spend all of my time thinking about talent, mostly in the context of tech companies.
We're here to talk about an idea, and an idea that then we've done some research on, so to put some numbers to it. But I will start with the idea. We're here to talk about return on talent. The genesis of this idea is that as we look across organizations, just about every organization spends the bulk of its money, the bulk of its resources, the bulk of its attention, frankly, on its talent. It's the single biggest investment that companies make, that organizations make. For most other types of investments, companies are really rigorous about how they make those investments, about the business case that goes into making that investment, about what the specific OKRs or KPIs, what are the metrics that are going to be changed as a result of it, and then real tracking against that to say, did we make a good investment? But for this giant investment that organizations make in their people, there isn't quite the same rigor. The fundamental idea we want to talk about, and then talk about some ways to bring that idea to life, is that organizations should have a laser focus on the return they get from their talent. Said another way, organizations will benefit, they will do better, they will turn more profit if it's a for-profit company, if they're getting the absolute most from their people that they can. We can use all sorts of words for that. We can use the word productivity. Sometimes productivity is a little bit of a dirty word. People think about cost reductions, they think about layoffs. But really, when we talk about productivity, we are saying we want to enable our workforce to do its absolute most, to do its absolute best, so that when we think about it from an organizational perspective, we're getting the most amount of performance, the most amount of productivity, the most amount of impact from our people. When we do that, if we get that balance right, we get that equilibrium right, organizations will do better from a performance standpoint, and our people will do better from a performance standpoint. Hopefully everybody wins. That's fundamentally the idea, that if we take this seriously, if we measure and we hold ourselves to a really high bar on getting the most return from our talent, that there's a real step change possible in how we get to a more productive workforce.
It's been hard to measure at first of what return on talent could truly be, which is why it's been much easier when you think about getting your return on investment instead. What we tried to at least begin doing was to say, what is the driver of lost productivity? So what is preventing employees from being at their best in some way to drive the most value for their organization? We've drilled it down really to three things. This is what we call the skill gap, the will gap, and the time gap. So the skill gap, there's real dollars around. It's about 22% of a productivity improvement is possible when you really get close that skill gap. What does that mean? It mostly looks like making sure employees are in the roles that are the most important for the organization and they have what they need to make them successful. So that means they have the tools, they have the capabilities, they have the prior investment from a learning and development or education perspective to be successful in role. And what employees in self-reported data say, what has made me most productive in role is to make sure that skill gap is as small as possible. The second that we talk about is the will gap. That is in some ways, call it more common than others to think about, which is to say, how do I increase the engagement of my people? How do I think about how to make me as an employee most excited about my job, most ready to kind of go after each day and I want to do the best work that I can and therefore increase my productivity? And we see that as a 6% productivity uplift. The last gap that we talk about is the time gap. As you think about a Gen AI future, a lot of companies are thinking more and more about how to close that time gap. That might be things like spending less time in meetings that don't really matter, or spending more time focused on, not just the handoffs or syndication meetings or one-off emails, but basically getting the inefficiency out of the system. And so that's one of the, call it easier ones to measure, which is to say, hey, how do I just save, even call it an hour a day for an average employee. That's something like $15,000 per employee a year if you're able to just reduce that 1 hour a day. So each of those three gaps are how we begin to quantify what this return on talent could look like. And we think more and more that the skill gap especially is critical to unlock.
I think, Sean, it's interesting why the skill gap is a place to focus, because To the points that you made, the time gap and the will gap are a little bit easier to measure. The second thing I'd say is that, particularly if you think about the time gap, it's a little bit more accessible for companies to go after. It's about unnecessary meetings and inefficient ways to access information and decision-making opportunities to get sharper. All of those, they frustrate us. They're things that we feel on a day-to-day basis. And so going after them is something that we've been trying to do for a long time. You think about all the work that's happened from an agile perspective and bring agile ways of working to organizations. That's fundamentally about going after the time gap. And when we think about some of the advances that are going on in AI, we heard a lot today about Copilot. These are ways to summarize meetings and help draft emails and take some of that time penalty out. So there's a lot of effort and good effort going after the time gap. Like you said, the will gap around engagement and discretionary effort that comes out of engagement, also something that organizations have spent a ton of time measuring. Most organizations have some way to measure the engagement or the employee experience that they're providing. And then real effort to try to change it. The skill gap is the hard one. It's the one where our current ways of thinking about this do not necessarily lend itself to measuring, are we getting the right fit, the best possible fit in all of our roles. The thing about our research suggests is that it's the biggest pot of money here. It's where the biggest opportunity is. And so I think what we wanted to spend some time is really getting into how can you start to make progress on the skill gap, on having the absolute right match between what a role requires and what an employee brings to it. And I think that we want to think about that from two standpoints. One is when we get that fit right, the organization benefits. You have a role that is important, that delivers value, and you've got the right person in it to deliver that value. I think we also want to flip it around and say that when you have a person with a certain set of skills and then they are in a role that actually takes full advantage, that challenges them to bring their best, and that's a person who is just a more engaged and honestly happier person at work.
Yeah, and right now at least we tend to think about closing that skill gap in two ways when you think about talent. There's the first, which I think in some ways, Neel, you were alluding to already, which is at the role level. It's really figuring out what are the subset of roles that drive disproportionate value for an organization. Sometimes in our kind of McKinsey lingo, you will hear it called talent to value, or how do you figure out what are those subset of roles that matter most? And then how do you separately figure out who are your best people? Who is the talent that you want to really invest in and make sure that they are successful and that they actually already have, in some ways, the skills and capabilities for that most critical role? And if they don't already have those skills and capabilities, how do we actually intentionally upskill or reskill them to be able to do that critical role? And we had a conversation earlier about L&D as a concept for organizations. A lot of companies spend a bunch of time and money on these kind of broad upskill plays that TBD how much value they're truly getting out of it. But if you look at it at the role level and you say, this is a role that really matters, this is a subset of talent that we think is well suited for that role, and we focus on real skill building for that talent to deliver, that can help you close the skill gap pretty directly and obviously. The second one is that we sometimes also talk about it at what we'd say the talent pool level, which is to say, how do you not just think about an individual role, but a whole kind of group of roles that can actually really be changed as you think about the skills that are required? So how do you then say, hey, what are the talent pools that matter broadly? How do we make sure that we actually have the full set of skills and capabilities for that talent pool? How do we think differently about how that talent pool is going to grow, how Gen AI is going to impact what a full job family needs to deliver? And then how do we think about what that skill journey looks like to deliver at the pool level? And we have a bunch of research on both of those fronts, which is to say you can't just think about roles and you shouldn't just think about talent pools either. It's the combination of the two to make sure that you're actually thinking differently about hiring, reskilling, upskilling to deliver. What else would you add?
I think that last point is the one I would just echo. If you think about often how HR organizations are structured, there's a little bit of a silo. There's people who do talent acquisition, there's people who do learning and development, there's some people who do performance management, talent management, and there's some people who do DE&I. And what we're really talking about is the formula for a higher return on talent is fundamentally about bringing all of those together and to understand what are the levers that for a particular talent segment, particular pool, or a particular role will optimize the output we get for that role. Sometimes it's going to be hiring new folks, and sometimes that's the easy way to think about what we could do here. But sometimes it's about upskilling. We heard an example of a video game company, and they did not have enough people to make their video games. They had a significant slate of games that they had to deliver. It's hard to find people with the technical computer science capabilities plus experience in building games, the domain experience, and they didn't know what to do. The answer for them was, when facing a skill gap, was to rethink what actually drove success for a video game developer and what were the components that they could hire for, what were the components they should train for. And that led to reconstituting their approach to hiring game developers and actually releasing some skill requirements. When they did that, the pool that they were able to source from got dramatically bigger. It also got dramatically more diverse, which was a real benefit to what they were trying to do from an overall culture perspective. It also meant that they had to supplement that pool with domain expertise, so domain training. And they built a 12-week program for new joiners to do that. And the impact was getting the coders they needed, getting a much more diverse pool of coders in, and being able to hit their pretty aspirational goals.
What I loved from that story too was that the talent that they brought in, at first you might have thought, oh, they're not experienced game designers, they're not going to be successful at this company, but they were. I think it was one role in total that had to rotate out over time. They actually were able to be reskilled in such a way that they were super successful in role. I think retention rate was even greater than for their kind of normal pool. It's, to your point, Neel, way more diverse. It's opened up a whole new slate of candidates. And as you think about in a go-forward model, it'll help them attract new talent too, to say, hey, you're really invested in me. You care about my development. You care about me learning new skills, which I think is very unique. And it can be like a value proposition differentiator too.
Here at Culturati, we've heard a few themes already emerge, one of which is the theme of empathy and how important empathy is in what we're trying to do here and build great cultures. And when you have a topic like productivity, it might not intuitively mean that, might not intuitively suggest to people that you're thinking in an empathetic way. And actually what I'd argue, really building what you're saying, Charlotte, is that thinking this way, thinking about maximizing the productivity of a workforce by getting the fit right, by getting the right talent in the right role, is actually a fundamentally empathetic way to think about talent management, think about workforce, think about HR more broadly. And it's because you are bringing the fundamental question of how do we equip our people to do their absolute best? How do we bring them the skills that they need? How do we give them the coaching they need, the support, the interventions? And if that match doesn't work, then how do we find a better match for them? And so I would argue that actually on this theme of empathy, thinking about the productivity of our workforce is squarely aligned. The other thing that we've had a lot of conversations here at Culturati about is AI, and honestly not just here. I mean, everyone's talking about AI. And I think that this is an area where AI is going to play a very big role. We mentioned a little bit about how AI and generative AI is helping going after the time gap.
Right.
The skill gap is one of those places where we have in front of us a set of questions to go answer. It's an exciting time, I think, for this. The idea fundamentally is that people will have access to much more expertise in the future in their role than they did in the past. And generative AI is what's going to help us do that. If we can harness that in the right way, harness that to be able to enable roles and augment people in those roles, that also starts to help close the skill gap. That's, I think the question to answer over the next few years as opposed to one we have the answers for.
Right.
But I think, there's a lot of exciting developments coming here. And if I was going to make one last point, it is this idea, this mindset of bringing a real focus on maximizing return on talent is actually what takes an HR leader, an organizational leader, and puts them in a different conversation. It puts them in a conversation about how do we drive the results of the business, how do we enable the P&L using the lever that we have, talent,
Right.
And all the things we can do to enable that talent.
Thank you. Thank you for having us as part of the Culturati team as well. We're super excited to be here, and the conversations today have been really energizing. I think the one major takeaway in my mind is that, exactly as Neel is describing, we're changing the conversation about what talent means, who talent are, what they are. An employee, it's gone from, hey, let's do some engagement surveys to make sure they're happy, let's see how they progress over time, and let's hope for the best, to really intentional management of talent in the same way that we manage financial capital. If you think about human capital as the same return. And it's not just about saying, okay, we actively manage out. That's not the point. The point is really to say, how do we make sure people have the skills they need to be successful and the energy and motivation and not time spent in dumb meetings and everything that they need to be successful. But how do you be way more intentional and way more thoughtful about what that opportunity is for companies? So we're really excited about the research and to be able to talk it through with you all.
Thank you.